Welcome to another episode of Independent Thought and Freedom, where we have conversations with some of the most interesting people around the world who are shaking up politics, society, economies, and ideas. We've had some amazing guests on this program, including The Saker, Paul Craig Roberts, Sheikh Imran Hussein, E. Michael Jones, Cynthia McKinney, and more. If you'd like to support us to reach our next goal of actually putting together live events where we bring some of my best guests side by side on one stage, please consider becoming a monthly subscriber on Patreon. You'll find the link below. Also, if you are an author or researcher with important ideas to share with the world and want to have a greater impact, I'm offering a free masterclass, 3 steps on how to leverage your intellectual authority to become a media personality. The link for that class is in the description as well. And now, on to this week's show. Welcome to Independent Thought and Freedom. We live in an age of information wars. Perhaps it was always like this, but the advent of social media and the internet has changed the dynamic fundamentally. Whereas before, you used to have to find out forbidden knowledge from maybe underground bookstores or pamphlets mailed to you by subscription, or friends and relatives, with amazing collections that you have no idea how they got their hands on all this stuff. But I remember those days fondly. But that's how I used to find like Malcolm X speeches or radical pamphlets or information about the FBI and CIA when they would carry out their heinous agenda, both within the US and around the world. But now, however, all this information is freely presented to you on the internet. But at least before the massive move to censor the internet that started about 2 years ago in earnest. But so with all this, even the events that I lived through in the 80s and 90s, for example, I now realize there were crucial things that I had no idea about that only now I'm finding out about because of old documents and old information that was otherwise suppressed during the time, but now it can be found online. For example, I went from being a Clinton supporter in the 1990s to now understanding that how much of today's problems, whether it be the West's relationship to Russia, the rise of the security state, the development of casino capitalism, the expansion of liberal imperialism, with NATO as a key element, the huge rise in income inequality, and so many other things can clearly be traced back to that pivotal administration. Now, mainstream academia and mainstream news have fought back hard against this attack on their information monopoly. They've also been joined by radical, violent activists on the left, especially Antifa, who've tried to shut down any platform for anybody who voices opinions or presents information that they don't approve of. Now, one of the most effective ways of shutting down conversation and inquiry is the use of the phrase conspiracy theory. And once one is labeled a conspiracy theorist, then one can dismiss anything that's said. However, I still believe in the old-fashioned notion that an argument should be judged on its own merits, by evidence and by logic. Nobody, whether it's approved thinking or not, these are the standards we have to go by. But we live in an age now where people are prosecuted for their thought crimes. And I suppose I've always been somewhat of a thought criminal. With that in mind, I'm pleased to have as my guest today author Philip Kraske, whose 5th novel, 11/9 and the Terrorist Who Loved Bonsai Trees, makes obvious allusions to 9/11. Philip Kraske was born in Detroit, but has lived in Madrid since the 1980s, where he teaches English. He has 5 novels published and is working on a 6th. In addition to novels, Philip also publishes satirical verse, an innovative form of op-eds, let's say, about domestic and international politics on his own and different progressive websites in the US. Welcome, Philip.
Nice to be with you, Kirk.
Yeah, great to have you on. How's it in Spain?
Well, it's a beautiful sunny day here, as it usually is here, which is one of the things that I love about living here. And we and really could use a little bit of rain, but when you see these clear as a bell blue skies, it sort of makes drought forgivable.
Right, right. Do you prefer living there to the US?
Yeah, I've always been satisfied that I have come to live here, and it's an interesting place. I like teaching English as a second language, which is how I butter my bread. And it's a wonderful climate, especially because my last years in America, I lived in Minnesota, which is very cold and snowy,
Yeah.
and it's not only cold and snowy, but it's cold and snowy from the middle of October all the way through the end of March. So, anyways, it's nice to live here and feel a little bit smug then in January and February, especially.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I know. I actually have some family out in Minnesota, and I grew up in Toronto in Canada, so I know what
Uh-huh.
those winters are like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't miss it myself.
Yeah.
But I know you grew up in Detroit, and Madrid is very different, isn't it?
Oh yeah, yeah. Madrid is a classic old European city, and it has sort of its its political quirks and its big city problems because it's a very dense city. The entire city of Madrid, to give you an idea, you could drive from north of it to south of it in about a half an hour,
Right.
and either way, north, south, or east or west, and so it's a very different kind of living experience. The good thing is that uh, the entire space outside of the cities and towns is completely free. It's just either tilled or, in most cases, completely wild. I would say that probably 70% of Spain is just open land. It's very nice. I love cycling here. You go
Right.
out and every 5 miles or so, there's a little village in case you need to fill up your water bottle, and it's wonderful.
It's interesting. As someone myself who's been in different countries and being in the different social and political contexts. I was wondering for you, has your residency in Spain, living in Spain, how did that connect to your political views? Would you say, it was either cause or effect? I mean, did you sort of flee the United States to get to Madrid, or was it that when you were in Madrid, your perspective changed, or how has that affected your worldview?
Well, I would say that living in Madrid, you look at the United States from afar, and so after some years, I am able to see the United States for both the forest and for the trees. I can see it as one who lives there, and I can see it from outside. And that gives me a very sort of unique perspective on writing about America. As for political views, I don't think living here has affected them very much. Um, I had very much formed my basic views about American life and American government before coming here because I studied international relations in college,
Right.
which is a very general kind of study. You get a little economics, a little politics, a little history, and that was very formative for me because my teachers gave me a very different perspective on America, on what it was doing. And especially, you have to remember, I studied in the period late 1970s, early 1980s,
Right.
when the United States had recently finished in Vietnam, and there was a great deal of suspicion of government and
Yeah.
skepticism of our foreign policy, and that influenced my studies and my professors quite a bit. And
Yeah.
so at that time,
Where was it you studied?
at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis,
Mm-hmm.
and which is the same place that the New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman also studied. I don't know if that's a plus or a minus, but anyways, at that time there was a great deal of skepticism of government, and that informed my views a lot, and got me to see the United States more as an imperial power, and get to see its dark side much more than you would get just reading the newspapers and so on.
And just another interesting thing is, so how I mean, you've been in Madrid for 30 years, so I
Yeah,
suppose, I'm about half your life, roughly, something like that.
yeah,
Um,
exactly half my life.
yeah, okay. And so, how do you perceive yourself, and how are you perceived in Madrid? Are you seen um, as the American, or are you seen as nativized, or what's your Spanish like, for example? I mean, do you
Well,
stand out because of
probably
that?
about half and half. When you live in a place as a foreigner, that is the first thing that they always relate to you. They relate to you as a foreigner,
Yeah,
um, and I think that's inevitable. But once they get to know me, they get to see that I'm sort of half and half.
yeah,
I've lived here so long that I speak fluent Spanish, and I have a lot of the same expressions and sort of urban worldview as people who live in Madrid. So,
right.
that's I'm seen as kind of half and half at the end.
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah, because I mean, I know there are some people when they go abroad, I suppose there's different types of anthropological models. There's going native, you reject your old society, you fully immerse yourself, or you always retain your original identity even in your new context, or somewhere kind of in between. So that's interesting, especially with the subjects you write about, and so forth, and especially being an American, which is sort of different from being from any other country because of
Yeah,
the
it,
power
it brings a
of
lot of baggage with it. Yes.
yeah, because of the power of America. So all that is a kind of nice context and introduction for me to and for the audience to understand your writing career. So tell me
Yeah.
a bit about your
Yeah,
writing career.
just one thing,
Sure.
Kirk, that I ought to add. One of the sort of oddities about being an expatriate, I'm sure you found this yourself, is that even though you've left your country, gone to another country, like it or not, you are still the reference for a lot of people about your original country.
Yeah.
And you find yourself having to explain your original country. So I have the dubious honor of having to explain, for example, Donald Trump, and it's quite something for somebody who has left his country. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And Donald Trump was what I mean, did you know about Donald Trump when you left? I suppose you would have. He would have been on some of
yeah.
the talk
I
show,
follow American
newspapers.
politics. Yeah,
No,
I
but I
follow
mean,
American politics
but
like everybody. Yeah.
in the 70s, did he come up as yet in the 70s and 80s? In the early 80s, he was on like David Letterman and stuff, I remember.
Yeah, yeah. He's always sort of been a big mouth, sort of at the fringes of celebrityhood. Yeah.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So yeah, so let's talk about your novels and your writing career. So when did you start writing?
Well, my father's a writer. He's a writer of children's books, and I started about the time I was in college, And then here in Spain, I began to write adult novels about in the middle 90s. And because you see, in my work, I teach English in Spanish companies. And normally between roughly 10 o'clock and 1 o'clock in the morning, I don't have any classes because that's, when the sort of meat of the working day. And so normally I write at that time. Of course, I had a lot of free time. And so that's when I began to write novels. And like many authors, I tried to get published and, sending out letters to publishers and so on, which is a very difficult kind of thing because there are so many people trying to publish their books.
Yeah.
And finally, I began to self-publish my novels in about, 2009.
Right. I remember reading Camille Paglia, who's someone who I really love, and I remember she told me, I mean, not me, she talked about how it took her 20 years to get Sexual Personae published. I think it was, it was, yeah, and when it finally broke out, it was a massive, underground success first. But yeah, it's the option of self-publishing is very, it's an avenue that's much more viable now than it used to be before. I mean, what your first novel was? What?
My first novel was Flight in February, which is a sort of a combination of a prison escape and an espionage story. And I've since all of my books are sort of thrillers, but they some of them have a more political bent, some less. My third novel is a love story combined with sort of a business thriller. And that book is the Magnificent Marianne, which I think of all my books is the favorite. Not necessarily the best written, but it's my favorite story because it has at its center a dancer, Marianne, who can't read and is a very strange kind of person, but dances beautifully. And she's in the star of a Broadway musical.
Right. Now, so, sorry, let's say the conspiracy theory type stuff that people will label as conspiracy theory, the false flag, the kind of more outre political ideas. Did you start off with that, or is it really 11/9 that you started to explore that in fiction?
No, in fiction, yes, but I think that my ideas about American politics, as I said, formed largely in college because we the students heard and read so much about the dirty dealings of America, for example, in Latin America and in other places, which, if you're from a town in Minnesota, is pretty shocking stuff. And, the more you heard about it, the more sort of upset and sort of morbidly fascinated you were. You didn't know that your country did this kind of thing. Exactly. So I've been on to American foreign policy and its dark side since that time.
Yeah.
11/9 and the alternative theories of it, which very quickly to me became very feasible, opened my eyes a little bit more, but I don't think a lot.
Yeah, but it seems in political discourse there is a kind of line, because Chomsky is acceptable, right? It's considered like, so if you go in the sort of mainstream media, let's say, if you espouse a kind of Chomskyan line, they might, people on the right, may express, immediate disapproval and reject you out of hand. But it's a different thing than, if you talk about, 9/11 possibly, being a false flag, for example. That sort of, that is like expulsion. That is like excommunication. They're seen, and
Yes.
it's kind of weird for me because I suppose I'm not. I'm 10 years younger than you, and so I kind of I got politicized in the eighties, and and it was kind of I would say in the same era as you because it was like the whole Latin America thing, the Sandinistas, the FMLN, and then Reagan was coming up and the invasion of Grenada, and and I remember too when I started to learn about all this stuff, it was shocking to me because I never thought about that. Um, so I understand that whole sort of can um, uh, the whole radical critique of American imperial policy was always there, but I don't know. It seems that there just is a very, very strong line. Where before they would have called you a commie, a socialist, or whatever, and labeled you that way, and maybe ridiculed that way. There's something quite different that even people on the left, even people who say were Chomskyan, right, and extreme critics of U.S. foreign policy, they wouldn't even want to, go to, that level of I guess conspiracy theory as they call it. And it's because of that label has a lot to do with it. By saying conspiracy theorist, it makes you an outcast automatically. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's very true. You make a very clear you draw a very clear line in that sense. It's one thing to be like Chomsky and criticize American foreign policy and the heavy-handed CIA tactics and corporate America that does a lot of dirty things in third world countries, paying off officials, doing down unions. But it's something else quite again to say that Americans were responsible for 9/11. Piers Robinson, who is an important investigator, researcher, British, of 9/11, he said it very well in an essay. He said, 9/11 is just not a subject for polite conversation. And that's, I think, says it all right there. You can talk to people about how American foreign policy should change, but to say that our own people were responsible for 9/11 is a very different matter. And a lot of people, even on the left, do not want to talk about that. Um, that's sort of a problem in getting a critical mass of people who believe that 9/11 should be reinvestigated, put together. Liberals will not want to talk about it. That's just the way it is. To go to that extreme is very tough. And the first thing, of course, that people always say when you talk about the alternative theories of 9/11, they say, "Oh, you're saying the U.S. government did it?" And that's really not the case. I don't think it was the U.S. government that actually that was, the sort of intellectual authors of the whole thing. Because when you say government, what are you talking about? You're talking about departments and agencies and meetings and memos and people who don't like the operation and they try to spike it and there are leaks and this and that. Obviously, with 9/11, that is not the case. And so, and also you have to remember, Kevin Ryan wrote about this in his very interesting book, Another 19, where he talks about another 19 suspects who ought to be investigated. Dick Cheney, for example, Paul Bremer, And he makes the point that you have to remember that all these people that were, in the White House or working in the administration on 9/11, just about all those people were outside the administration, were not in government when 9/11 was planned, which obviously would have been, probably going well back into the Clinton administration. Probably when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell apart, the people who are in charge of American foreign policy, the sort of deep state, they realized that they had a very serious problem. They no longer had an enemy that they could count on to justify budgets, justify an important military state, and that's probably when planning for 9/11 began. But again, with people who were not in government.
Yeah. I mean, for me, I don't. I'm open to theories, but I am not definitive on who did it or anything like that. Because it gets so much into speculation. It gets so, and I'm not saying that you shouldn't, but it gets extremely sensitive, and this it's a taboo subject, as you say, and
that's true.
People are, people get extremely offended. You get banned on YouTube and public platforms for just asking questions. It's a really tough thing, but certainly, I mean, in my own, I like to hear your journey, but I'll explain my own sort of journey to it. I guess even when you think back to the Iran-Contra hearings, I remember, I was a teenager at the time, in my late teens, and that was incredible. I mean, to hear about they're pushing drugs to arm rebels, and it was done outside, and this was all public, and and then Oliver North, I couldn't believe it that he was then kind of a folk hero among some people afterwards, and I mean, so that just sort of revealed for me that wow, there's all these stuff that are actually going on. And then then later on, but I never I wasn't into the sort of you have the kind of survivalist and the that kind of fringe element, if you want to put it that way. Although I don't ostracize a lot of these theories. Once there's logic and evidence behind it, I'm open to hearing it. But so I don't.
The who did it part of it is always the toughest nut to crack.
That's right.
I mean, even people who can give you chapter and verse about the Kennedy assassination, you say, okay, I get how it was done, with moving the Secret Service back from the president and so on and so forth. Okay, I get that.
That's right.
So who did it? And at that point, people who know it all about how it was done kind of go all soft in the mouth, and they say, well, it could have been Johnson, it could have been the CIA, it could have been this, could have been that, and it's all, it's all worthy speculation, but there's no evidence anywhere to go on. And
is that why you ended up writing
the same thing with 9/11?
Is that why you ended up writing a sort of fictionalized? I wouldn't even call it. Would you say it's a fictionalized version of it, or would you say it's sort of an alternate reality? How would you?
Oh, yeah, I would call it an alternative to 9/11. I thought somebody had to sort of stick up for the alternative version of 9/11. That's one of the reasons that I wrote it. And I realized that if I wrote about 9/11, well, everybody would tear it to shreds with inaccuracies and this and that. And so I wrote about an alternative, a different terrorist attack, and used that as a vehicle to show all of the different points of view. One of the victims, one of the people who put on the show, who did it, which I call the in the book, what do I call them? The doers.
Right.
And the doers are a group of people who are not in government, but they sort of have the tacit approval of the major agencies and so on. And they plan this whole thing. And of course, when you see it from their point of view, they're doing what they think is right for the country. Because, of course, presidents, congressmen, this and that, they come and go. But somebody has to keep America headed in the right direction in the world. And that's what these people do. So I put in their point of view. I put in the point of view of the public, the point of view of the people who manipulate the media, and the reporters themselves. One of the points that I was very careful to make in the book is that nobody is telling these reporters, say this, don't say that. These reporters know how to handle a crisis like this, an event like this, which is to follow the government line. You can embroider it, you can do profiles of the victims, but you don't touch the government line on the event. And it's the same thing with 9/11. And so I called my book 11/9, which, as David Ray Griffin in the little blurb that he very kindly gave me on the cover of the book, 11/9 is a mirror image of 9/11, and that's what I wanted to write about.
Right. Yeah, I mean, for me, I by seeing all the things that the U.S. has done in various third world countries, which I'm obviously connected to in the Caribbean, in Asia, and so forth. I mean, it's atrocious, So for a lot of people outside of the U.S., it's not that much of a leap to think, what the U.S. government might do to its own people. But I do think that it is kind of difficult to think that U.S. officials would have done it to their people, had done something so heinous, so murderous to their own people, even in the absence of an emergency. I mean, the whole idea of mutual assured destruction, I suppose, is holding your population hostage in any case. But I mean, but there are certain things like I think the Zeitgeist movie was the first thing that alerted me to the whole idea that the official story of 9/11 doesn't add up. The way the buildings fell and the architecture and just the physics of it do not match up at all. It's just not possible. And then we have all these architect reports and engineering reports that are coming out and continue to come out to this day. So there's obviously something wrong. There's something wrong with the science of it all, And then later on, in doing different research, then I came across like MK Ultra, Gladio, and these things aren't just in conspiracy websites. I mean, they're acknowledged by the BBC. I mean, these
they're
are
history, sure.
Yeah.
Operation Northwoods, etc. Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so when you look at these things, I mean, you really do have to be open to it. I am, I do think that it would be a huge it would have to be pure evil for people to actually contemplate something on that scale merely for
Kirk,
political ends. Yeah.
Well, one thing you have to remember, Kirk, is that on 9/11 about 3,000 people died. But on the other hand, what you could say is that it was only 3,000 people, because all of the 4 planes that were used on that day, the average capacity of them was only 25%, where the average capacity on that day was 78%. The airplane that hit the Pentagon was hit the side of the Pentagon that was being rebuilt. It was in construction, and there were very few people there. Not so many people died. The first airplane hit the North Tower,
Yeah.
at 8:45 in the morning when still people were arriving at work. If
Yeah.
they had simply flown around for another half hour, they would have hit the buildings when they were full, and the casualties would have been much higher. And what you see um, all through the 9/11 saga is, I think, the hand of somebody who was at the top who said, okay, do it, but with a minimum of casualties. And so when you look at what happened as opposed to what could have happened, like
Yeah.
if Carlos the Jackal had been in charge,
Yeah.
is actually a very small number.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and certainly in terms of when you compare it to wars and how many, lives lost in bombings and all that kind of
Sure.
stuff. Yeah. But I mean, but for an attack on American soil, it's definitely unusual. I mean, now, so what is your view? I'm just interested in your view of 9/11 itself. Then about Osama bin Laden, Islamic terrorism, and so forth. Do you think that they existed and were used, or it's purely fictional and made up, or where there's a whole range of theories there.
Yeah.
Where do you stand?
Well, I think that one of the most intriguing aspects of 9/11 is that Osama bin Laden himself, twice in the 15 days after 9/11, said himself that he was not involved and Al Qaeda was not involved, and he condemned the attacks because they were against innocents. And
Yeah.
that fact, and again, he said it twice, once on Al Jazeera and another time in an interview with a Pakistani magazine called Ummah. That fact kind of stands like a big telephone pole in the middle of a racetrack. And it has to be taken into account when you think about it. That statement is of almost superhuman honesty, because the point of terrorism is to say, I did it, because it doesn't make any sense otherwise. Otherwise, I mean, okay, 3,000 people died, and it was a terrible thing, but it's only a sort of symbolic prick against a nation. 3,000 people die in a few months on American highways. Terrorism only makes sense when somebody takes credit for it. The other thing is that it seems to me that what could have happened with Al Qaeda and 9/11 is that somehow some people who thought they were working for Al Qaeda, for example, Muhammad Atta, were going to do this plot. Somehow somebody got onto it, and American spies or some very subtle people helped this whole thing along, and sort of nursed them along and kept the FBI away from them, and then mined the two twin towers with explosives so that they would fall,
Yeah.
and made the whole thing a lot worse. And it seems to me that a lot of people, for example, John Kiriakou, who was in the CIA at that time, he does not agree with the alternative theories at all. But it seems to me that there's not necessarily a contradiction. It may have been that some people got on to this plot, helped it along, and that maybe bin Laden and the top people in Al Qaeda were just very subtly kept away from this, and that's how the whole thing was pulled off, so that bin Laden denied involvement, and obviously believed what he was saying. But on the other hand, some people who thought they were working with Al Qaeda were actually the ones involved.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that that could be what happened.
And then also, I mean, the invasion of Afghanistan afterward, the invasion of Iraq. I mean, and then this idea of a war on terror. It supports the so-called conspiracy theorists, because it's not a war on Al Qaeda. It's a war on terror, which is endless. There's no end. So when are we ever going to defeat terror? And then you
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
then you have your fake war in Iraq, and then Afghanistan. That was totally questionable. I mean, the Taliban, okay, maybe they gave shelter to Bin Laden, I guess. I mean, they would know because they funded the Mujahideen and Osama bin Laden in the first place. But that war is not even finished. I mean, it's still going on. It's hard to believe that there's an 18-year war. I don't even know if war is the right word. It's not war. It's something else. But there's been an 18-year engagement there. But certainly, the effects of um, of 9/11 on foreign policy and the military-industrial complex. I mean, it fits in with it because it does not make sense. It really does not make sense. So what's your view on that?
Well, yeah, you're quite right. Before we had communism, and communism had a capital in Moscow. It had a country. It had a whole army behind it, and it was tangible. But it was on the other side of the ocean, and and the Cold War, was erected to fight it. And of course, the Cold War served a lot of other purposes, like empowering the military security sector. Um, and then terrorism, when the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union fell apart, as I said, they needed something different. And no country stepped up to fill the void. So terror was invented. And what is terror? Well, terror is anything you want. Terror is, around the corner. Terror is, some guy who's going to step out and start shooting at the crowd. It's a very personal kind of thing. It's very easy to scare people with terror. It's much easier than it was with communism. And this allows people to agree with a war in, a place that they can hardly even find on a map, which is in Afghanistan. And the military has been, as you say, is it really war? Well, I suppose it is. What else can you call it? But I don't think the military is terribly interested in ending it. I think they're quite happy to continue it because a war gives the military a certain amount of power in government.
Yeah, I
And
mean, and every time Trump says he wants to pull out, everybody goes ballistic. They're just crazy. If he said he wants to pull out of Syria or pull out of Afghanistan or whatever, they're both left and right, the Republicans and the Democrats. They're going crazy with the fact of pulling out. You have to stay everywhere all the time. It's really insane.
yeah, if there's anything to be said for Donald Trump, it's that. Obviously, he flies by the seat of his pants. But obviously his gut feeling is to stay out of war if he can avoid it. And obviously that's one of the reasons that he fired John Bolton, because Bolton was pushing him that way, and he doesn't want to go that way.
Yeah.
Which
I mean,
I think is the
during the
only.
primaries, you'd remember. I mean, when he called out Jeb Bush saying how your brother lied, when he said, we have blood on our hands, when he called out the FBI and CIA, I could not believe a presidential candidate, let alone for the Republicans, would say that on national TV in the largest political forum possible. That was incredible. That was incredible. I mean,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
So,
If there's anything good about Trump winning over Hillary, it's probably, and it's probably the only thing, it's that Hillary would surely have taken us into war, and we probably would have been at war with Syria and Russia by now. And
yeah,
I think Donald Trump, bad as he is, may have saved us from that.
absolutely. I absolutely think so. But yeah, so in one of your other interviews, I was listening to, there was an interesting discussion you had where somebody was asking you about hope, and you said, well, you didn't think that you had much hope to offer, um, because you think that the middle class. Well, no, I don't think you used the word middle class. I think you might have just said ordinary people, um, would not accept that the government would do this against them. You want to elaborate on that a little? If
Yeah,
you
I think
remember what
that
I'm
that's
talking about.
what one of the points I make in my book. I believe it's the Media Man talking about it, saying that you have to remember that the government and the government version is always the always has the home field advantage, and that is that unless an overpowering case is made, and or for example somebody comes forward and gives some information, the government is always going to win because they have a very compliant media on their side. And that's unfortunately the way it is. You can find out a lot of interesting things about 9/11, but it's all on the internet. And on the
Yeah,
internet, you can say whatever you want.
yeah,
And so it's, you know, it's the sad fact of the matter. I don't think that people are really ever going to support the alternative position on 9/11 as strong as it is.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It really is something. Although, I guess I suppose that that's the point about being marginal. I mean, certainly among that is the case among, let's say, the aspirational middle class for sure, but definitely among the African American community, for example, right? Who believe that AIDS is a vaccine, created by the government, and who have been, used by the CIA and FBI for all sorts of experiments, and who, the assassination of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King and the Black Panthers, and they have experienced the heavy hand of government for decades. They are quite open to these sorts of ideas in a way that the aspirational middle class are not. There was a very interesting, and then of course, uh, lower class whites as well, the rural areas and so forth, have also felt the heavy hand of government, and this is where I think the populist right and the populist left have a lot in common. There was a very interesting skit on Saturday Night Live, I think around the election time, 2016, with Tom Hanks. I don't know if you ever saw it. It's Black Jeopardy. They have uh, a running gag or a running skit called Black Jeopardy, and they had a white guest, kind of a redneck guy, and Tom Hanks was that guy, and they were supposed to, everyone looked at him funny and thought he was so out of place, but he could answer the questions, and had the same sort of mindset as they did. I thought it was a great
Uh-huh.
skit. Did you see it? Did you ever see it?
No, no, I didn't
Okay.
see that. But
It,
they
it,
do some very good things on Saturday Night Live.
yeah,
Yeah.
it was very funny. It was very funny. Um, and it, yeah, so I think that there is this uh, there is an openness. I mean, yourself. I mean, people like among intellectuals, among people, university educated people who were, educated in that, critical political economy, like with Noam Chomsky, with these working class communities, black communities. There is a constituency, but I suppose it's always marginal, and maybe that's
Yeah.
sort of the structural feature of the society. What's your view?
Yeah, I think that's true. And a lot of people, blacks especially, poor people in America, they certainly know the heavy hand of government a lot more. Um, but it's something that you read about if as you say, if you've had a university education and you know a little bit more about the sort of dark workings of government. But one of the sort of interesting things about what's going on now, even among people who are well-read, intellectual, is how narrow the political debate really is. I mean, Stephen Cohen, for example, who is a Russian expert, he was always, publishing articles in the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal talking about Russia. And he was sort of the go-to guy for any talk show who wanted analysis of Russian politics. But what's happened? He doesn't have doesn't share the opinion of the foreign policy establishment that Russia is evil and that Putin is trying to take over the United States and, twist our elections and so on. And suddenly he has found himself very much on the fringe. He does not get to publish anymore in the Times, the journal, and at most he can get an interview on RT, and that's it. And a lot of people have been ostracized from the foreign policy debate because of their views. I remember William Pfaff, the great International Herald Tribune columnist for 25 years on foreign policy, and in about 2004 he was against the invasion of Iraq, and immediately the International Herald Tribune dropped his column, as did several others. Yeah. Nobody wanted to hear that point of view. And especially since 9/11, among intellectuals, among people who read, people who write, the opinion has been more and more constricted. And if you're outside of the normal opinion about these things, you're out. You don't get a platform. Max Blumenthal has also commented on the same thing. It's really a terrible environment that we're living in right now.
Yeah, it really is. And even someone like Paul Craig Roberts, who was part of the Reagan administration, he was
Reagan's administration.
Yeah, editor at Wall Street Journal, at so many prestigious universities, throughout the country. I mean, he was the inner core of the inner core of sure. American, public life, and he is a total persona non grata.
Nobody interviews him on NBC, that's for sure.
Yeah, that is just amazing, really, what's happened with the media. And I don't know if the internet highlights this thing more, or if it's always been like that, because sometimes some of the things I've discovered about people who I just never knew about in the 1980s and 70s, because they were because that's when we only had, America only had NBC, CBS, ABC, and that was it. And, you might have had your other little stations here and there, but, there was that tight control and over information, and then the internet opened things up for a while, and now it closed up tight. It's beginning to close up tightly again. So it really is something there. Anything else you want to say on that?
You're right. Yeah, it just I think that before, say, up until through the Clinton administration, there was a much wider spectrum of views that you could see on all of the mainstream, especially in newspapers at times, etc. And I think that one reason we see these people more on internet is just that they've been pushed to the internet. They would prefer, of course, to be in a more a better environment with a bigger audience, but they can't get it anymore. Like Foreign Affairs, for example, which is sort of the basic mainstream foreign policy journal, they used to have more opinions on a wider variety of subjects. But now they hold no truck with anybody who's not going to say that, the Syria, Assad doesn't need to be overthrown, or we don't need to be in Afghanistan, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very a very limited, very gray political, intellectual environment now.
Yeah. To me, I think that I remember during the war in Iraq when CNN and the other major media houses were embedded in the military. Yeah, I don't know if you remember. That was a term they
Yeah,
used, that they were embedded. I don't think they ever became disembedded after that. I
yeah,
think that was a real I think that was a real turning point. And once they became embedded, that was it. That was it. They
yeah.
just
They're still in bed with those guys. Yeah,
that's right. That's right. Exactly. Exactly. Right. Now, um, now I see with your op-ed pieces, your verse, you recently wrote something on Saudi Arabia, which to me seems like a false flag. That one,
yeah,
I would much more easily and readily say that looks like a false flag uh, conducted
yeah.
by the U.S. government. It just does not make sense. What's a um,
Well, my
yeah,
point of view in the poem, which is that it's about these sort of private security guys who have been, advising the Saudi government, and they're all sitting around, sort of rubbing their jaws and saying, "Huh, drones? Who would have thought? We prepared for everything else, but they go and they use drones now. Who figured that out?"
yeah.
And of course, the Houthis, who knows, but they have a reputation of having drones, but not very powerful ones. And let's face it, to pull off an attack like that, I believe 10 drones were used, and really powerful ones, all hitting their targets. I mean, that's pretty darn good. And I'm not
That's
saying the
right.
Houthis are a bunch of pikers, but you know,
Yeah,
maybe maybe they really did have that kind of possibility. But it looks very very difficult to me.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and it, and even if they did do it, the whole point is that the U.S. and Saudi Arabia are not accepting that. So
Yeah,
they're all it's all it's all pushing something on Iran. And it makes no sense. It makes no sense that Iran would attack Saudi Arabia. Like it wants the world against it. It's
yeah, yeah.
and
That's one writer made that point. I don't remember who it was, but anyways, he was talking about how even when Saudi Arabia and Iran have kind of been knocking heads together, nobody touched the other one's oil facilities because they
yeah,
know that they're completely vulnerable. So everybody's just said, okay, that's off limits. It's a little bit like mafia families saying, okay, you can
yeah,
hit my man, but don't hit my daughter, that sort of
that's
thing.
right.
And of course, you write down a list of people who would have an interest in a Saudi Arabia refinery getting hit, and it's a very long list.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
who knows? And actual drones. Well, you can probably buy them, 10 for a few bucks in any arms bazaar. So
exactly,
who knows? Who knows who did it?
exactly. Well, one other question I wanted to ask about your craft, about yourself as a novelist. I know you've said you've modeled yourself in a sense on John le Carre, Graham Greene. Um, but would you consider yourself a novelist first, or a kind of philosopher or political critic that uses fiction? How do you see yourself?
Oh, it's an interesting question. I think that I would call myself more a novelist because really I'm a generalist, not a technician, not an expert. And of course, I do research about the necessary things of any of the novels that I write, but I get enough information to understand the situation, and I put enough of that in the book to make the whole thing feasible. But I don't agree with writers who do all this research and they put all of it in their book just to show you how much research they've done, it always ends up sounding to me a little bit, I don't know, a little bit smarmy, a little bit smart alecky. So I think I would consider myself a writer first and an intellectual second.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that I think that art has to be seen as totally independent from politics, because art suffers when art becomes merely a tool to express one's political point of view. I really think the art suffers badly. I mean,
Yeah,
I love.
when you
Yeah, sorry, go on.
no when you push your point of view to back up a certain argument, then you're entering into propaganda, and I try
Exactly.
never to do that.
Yeah. Because I love. I mean, two of my favorite. I mean, my favorite writers are like George Orwell and V.S. Naipaul and C.L.R. James and they allowed. And I think that's what made them such great political thinkers as well, because they were great artists first. So they had to observe humanity for what it is, and people for who they are, and then build politically that way, rather than have your theory first and then sort of fit people, and you have all this stilted dialogue and this unnatural plot, and just because you want to force through some sort of political point of view.
Exactly.
And I see
Exactly,
too much political art,
yeah.
that, and yeah.
I see a
And
lot of that, for example, in the novels of Tom Clancy or Frederick Forsyth. They force this glorious view of the military and secret services and so on, and I think that their work is the worse for it.
yeah. The only exception I would say is Plato, because
Ah,
I mean, when you read the dialogues properly, when you read Republic, like especially book one, and Thrasymachus and arguing with Socrates, and it's so powerful up to today. But what's great about Plato, and what people don't realize, um, is that Plato never prescribed anything. So in that sense, he was a true artist. Plato never said you
mhm.
should do this. Plato never even said the ideal republic that Socrates talked about for 10 books, or however many books it took, um, was what you should follow. I mean, because there's great interpretation by Leo Strauss and Alan Bloom, who unfortunately are neocons, um, but their interpretation of Plato was that, listen, that was actually a satire. He never meant, he wanted to show how absurd, like with the breaking up of families, and that absurd equality of men and women to that extreme, could never ever, especially for an ancient, could never be seen as a realistic proposition. So it was meant as a kind of absurdity, as a kind of anti-utopia, and so it was meant for
Yeah,
you to think. So there's this whole debate, but the point is that Plato wrote these amazingly robust and human and thoughtful debates and dialogues, and we're supposed to think uh, through out of that, and that's why 3,000 years almost later,
yeah.
we still find it so engaging.
Mhm.
You have any thoughts on that, Plato and all that kind of stuff?
Well, as a writer, I'm rather ashamed to say that I haven't read much of Plato. A little bit, but I'm afraid I've always read more modern writers,
Yeah,
at least starting with Joseph Conrad and that
yeah.
sort of thing.
Let me highly suggest to you to get the Agora Publications uh, audio book recording. They dramatize it, and they have
Oh,
different actors reading the parts. That's what turned me on to it, when I really understood what Plato was doing. Agora Publications,
yeah,
Republic.
that's a good idea. Sure.
Yeah, it's
Hmm.
actually brilliant stuff. Yeah. So tell me, what's your next book going to be about? You're working on your sixth, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm working on another one, just kind of feeling my way through it. It's about, well, I don't know if you've heard about this much, Kirk, but after the Vietnam War, there were a lot of rumors about POWs left behind in Vietnam,
Yeah.
because the American government didn't want to pay war reparations, which they had agreed to in the treaty. America never paid the reparations, and so the Vietnamese never returned half the prisoners. And so I'm writing a novel about a guy who, after 50 years, he escapes. He was a doctor in Vietnam, and he escapes and returns to America. And what happens to him?
Okay, that's very, very interesting. Yeah, I remember in the 80s it was still a big thing because, I mean, people, the POWs still would have been alive, and the families used to, made
Yes. Yeah.
they were still, pressing for the return of the POWs. I remember that. All the bumper stickers and all that kind of stuff they used to have. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. An
Yeah.
excellent book. An excellent book to read about it is An Enormous Crime by Bill Hendon, and you
Okay.
can find it on Amazon or in used bookshops and things like that. Very interesting. Very interesting account of the whole thing.
Nice.
And, just the connection to 9/11, one thing stands out. The book covers a period of about 25 years from the end of the war all the way to the early 2000s. And in all that time, only one person very quietly talked to Hendon and gave him some inside information. It was a Secret Service agent who overheard a conversation just outside of Ronald Reagan's Oval Office. And the point that I'm trying to make here is that when people say the common, the most common argument against the alternative theories of 9/11, somebody would have talked. When people say that, I remind them of the Bill Hendon book, because in all that time, only one guy talked. And in the case of 9/11, well, a few people have talked, and their stories have stayed on the internet. But I'm sure that a lot of people talked to reporters in the wake of 9/11, very quietly, very discreetly, telling them, "Look, I was there, and I heard this, and I saw that, and so on, and this is a big thing." And I'm sure that some writers probably, their eyes get big as plates, and they say, "Oh, I've got a Pulitzer Prize here for the taking if I investigate this right." So they do, and they write it up, and they give it to the editor, and the editor says, "Well, yeah, but we're not gonna publish something this revolutionary." And even in the best case, if the reporter pushes back, maybe the editor says, all right, we'll go with it, but you've got to bring me three other sources, say the same thing, all of them willing to go on the record, and they've got to be absolutely impeccable sources. And of course, then the whole thing goes out the window.
Yeah.
So when people say somebody would have talked, I say, yeah, somebody would have talked. But who would have published it? Certainly not the mainstream media. But you can find their stories of a few people, of about a dozen people who have talked about things on the internet.
That's right.
But again, on internet, you can say anything. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Marshall McLuhan really was right when he said the media is the message. You put it in the Times, or you say it on CBS News, and it has some weight. You put it on the internet, well, it just disappears.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. But your next novel isn't really going to be touching on 9/11 or anything like that, is it?
No, I don't think so.
Right. Yeah. Well, which is interesting, and it supports the point we were making earlier, that I mean you're not pushing a political point of view in your body of work. It's kind of self-contained. You have it there. Now you have your other novel, and you're allowing your work to develop, each novel with its own integrity, rather than
Yeah, my novels have jumped around quite a bit. This is my first novel that I told you about. The second one is a sort of gamed political presidential election the romance I told you about, my previous novel, number 4, takes place in Quito, Ecuador, which is where I lived for a year, and it's a sort of a thriller, political thriller about some different aspects of American policy in Latin America, and I think it's a really, really interesting portrait of Ecuador and of policy there. It sold very well among tourists, by the way, because
Okay.
a friend of mine, yeah, a friend of mine got it placed in the 2 main airports of the country, Quito and Guayaquil. And so tourists saw a novel about Ecuador and they bought it.
Right. Excellent. Excellent. Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, that's interesting. I mean, it leads me to another point, which is, uh, I mean, it would have been a real risk for you to write about 9/11 and therefore, undermine all your other stuff because that's the way this conspiracy theorist label works, that, oh, well, he's a conspiracy theorist, so therefore everything he says and everything he writes can be considered cranky or kooky or whatever they want to say about it. I mean, so yeah.
Well,
So,
I guess I just hope they read my other novels first, Kirk. So what can I tell you? What can I
yeah,
say?
yeah,
Although
yeah. So,
I have to say
uh-huh.
the sales of 11.9 and the Terrorists Who Love Bonsai Trees are going very well because I've done some interviews like this one, and I've this has been my bestseller.
Wow. So that's interesting. Very interesting, isn't it? Um, and to me, things like that give me hope that I suppose I have this naive hope that once people know the truth, they'll gravitate to that. So
Yeah.
some people say that's naive, and I suppose even in my as I approach my old age, I'm still in that naive mindset. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Mhm.
but that's great. That's great. So I want to thank you very much for the interview. It's been a pleasure talking to you about these issues, and I wish you all the best in your new novel.
Well, thank you, Kirk. It's been a pleasure to talk to you, and let's do it again sometime when I have the next one put out.
Yeah, that'll be great. Well,
Hmm.
that's all for independent thought and freedom this week. Please join us again next week, and in the meanwhile, make sure you subscribe, leave me a rating, like and share this podcast with your friends. And please check out Philip Kraske's books, his all 5, including 11.9 and The Terrorist Who Loved Bonsai Trees. So, thanks and bye for now.
Bye bye, Kirk.